All right, so we're excited to kick off our next talk on sustainable cultivated seafood. Joining me on the panel is Mihir, Pershad, CEO of Umami Meats.
Today, I'll tell you a bit more about what we're doing at Umami Meats and how we're trying to bring about a sustainable seafood future that involves cultivated rather than caught fish. And our reason for working on this particular problem area is one that maybe not so apparent in the US, but is incredibly apparent from where I sit here in Singapore and in Asia in particular. And that is that we are producing less and less seafood from the oceans every year. We have basically hit sustainable wild capture limits and are now exceeding those. We're able to produce more by farming, but the growth rate of farming is slowing dramatically. And there's going to be a supply gap of about 70 million tons of fish by mid-century. And that gap has started to emerge since about 2018, 2019, between the demand for protein from the oceans and the ability to supply that. And in particular, this is important because consumers are really seeing increasing reasons to eat more seafood. And especially when you look at the premium categories, the aspirational categories, there's some intrinsic strengths to seafood as a product category that are driving increased purchasing and increased desirability. So number one, just from a health standpoint, seafood is a highly digestible protein. So fish has the greatest digestibility, meaning you get the most nutrition from what you eat. It's also highly nutritious from a perspective of getting essential amino acids, vitamins, trace metals that you need in your diet, and healthy fats like omega-3. So particularly as people move into the middle class, have more earning power, they start to want to purchase more seafood, and in particular, not the low-cost seafood that may be a staple in some Asian countries, for example, like carp or tilapia, but they start to want to purchase salmon for omega-3. They want to start to purchase tuna for versatility and flavoring. And I think one of the more important things here as well is that seafood from fish especially is incredibly flexible. It's one of the proteins that can be turned into dozens of different formats and cooked in a variety of different ways that are all compelling and prominent in different cultural representations. And so what we see basically is that consumers know they want more fish and they want more premium fish. But going back to that prior diagram, premium fish is actually one of those categories that is most difficult to farm. And so our focus at Umami Meats is to prioritize these species that are premium, meaning that they're expensive and aspirational, but that they're also species that are at the greatest risk of extinction. So these are fish that cannot be easily produced or harvested sustainably at current levels, or even at levels that would meet growing demand. And so in particular, we look for species that we cannot easily farm and that are already on the IUCN, that's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, their globally set list of endangered species. And so we've picked three to start with: the Japanese eel, the red snapper, and big eye tuna. So eel is endangered or critically endangered around the world. All of the half dozen or so species that we eat are in these categories. Red snapper is vulnerable, but rapidly depleting in the North Atlantic in particular. And big eye tuna has gone from sustainable to vulnerable over a period of less than 15 years and is in steep decline worldwide. But these are the fish that create aspirational dishes like what you see on the right that people go to restaurants or that want to eat more of as they earn more. And collectively, there's about a $60 billion annual spend for these three species, of which tuna makes up about 2/3. And at Umami Meats, our goal is to sort of take a stepwise approach to have a clear roadmap to these premium aspirational products, but in a way that is technically achievable step by step. So we want to get to revenue earlier to build a commercial business rather than staying in R&D mode for 2 or 3 more years just to hit the most premium product as our first launch. But we also think it's important to have empathy and focus on local taste, because the same fish is eaten in different ways in different places. And it's critical that you produce the fish the way it's going to be consumed in Thailand or in Japan or in US. And the goal is to build a broad product portfolio that allows partners who we work with to commercialize these in geographies around the world. So we anticipate starting with smaller individual portions and small pieces of what you might see as sort of filet chunks that are common in soups, in curry dishes, in noodles, particularly across Asia. Grilled in smoked eel will be the next product that we aim to launch, focused around North Asia, particularly Japan and Korea, but also increasingly in sushi chains and restaurants across the US. And then over the next couple of years, moving toward whole fillet whitefish that's premium, like a snapper, for example, that could be a plate fish for the European consumer, and sushi grade tuna products that are the high end of the fish market. And for us, the strategy is very much building collaboratively with partners rather than trying to do this alone. Seafood is a $200 billion industry and growing, and there's no way that a single company can revolutionize an industry of that scale by itself, particularly when you have to sell physical hard products, right? It doesn't scale the same way software does. And so for us, the strategy is think globally, but act locally and execute locally with strategic partners on a regional basis. So we're initially focusing quite heavily on North Asia. Japan and South Korea are key markets for us because that's where the cultural drive for premium seafood starts and goes global. And so we've already secured MOUs with Japanese manufacturing giants, as well as with companies to actually commercialize products under their brands locally in Japan. In our home region in Southeast Asia, we've actually got our first commitment from a company based out of Malaysia that will be serving most of Southeast Asia through our collaboration. And they're actually committed capital already to co-development of these products with us. And we're now looking to expand into the EU and into the US, pending regulatory acceptance in many of these markets. But we think it's important to build the relationships and build the market early. And that's very much how we're positioning. And the other piece of this that I haven't really touched on yet, but that's critical to market adoption, is being able to drive costs down to price parity. Consumers want to eat healthier. They want to eat, especially in more wealthy Western markets, they want to eat more climate neutral or even sustainable by other metrics, for example, biodiversity, sustainability. But often consumers don't have the capability to pay substantially more. And especially in the times we have now with high inflation, this is more of a concern for most consumers than ever. And so our view is that we need to have a comprehensive approach to rapidly drive costs down. And so our target is actually to manufacture at price parity out of our pilot plant and to be basically selling with a positive margin to high value species like eel out of a pilot. And then as we go to commercial scale, being able to manufacture with relatively healthy margins of 40 to 50% for our manufacturing partners, and being able to then sell at price parity for species like snapper and tuna as well to the mass consumer. And so we have a couple of core technologies that help us to bring the prices down. One is around cell technology. So we've established a unique cell type called an MSC, or a mesenchymal stem cell. And this is a stem cell that can produce muscle, fat, and connective tissue. So basically it produces everything that you'd want to eat. But it's much more easily controlled than other kinds of stem cells that are often used for human therapies, for example. And we've been able to develop these with no GMO so that they're going to be broadly acceptable to consumers around the world. We can feed them on a plant and algae-based growth media that helps to really bring costs down, because the vast majority of our costs is actually in the feed of what you feed the cells to grow them. And we're implementing machine learning in multiple ways to help optimize the development process, so the experimental process, as well as to optimize end product formulation to make sure we're matching the nutrition and the flavor and the aromatic profile of the target product. Because if something doesn't taste good and it doesn't smell good, it's not going to get picked up by consumers, even if the price is right and even if the nutrition's right. And then lastly, really working with manufacturing partners to scale more quickly and more lean so that we're able to take advantage of their deep CapEx capability and our innovative thinking rather than trying to take on everything ourselves. And to give you a little bit of a showcase of what we've been able to do so far, I'll just show you what we've been able to produce. So we started with a very Singapore concept. This was launched only in Singapore. It's called a fishball laksa. And so laksa is a traditional coconut curry dish, and we made fish balls using our cells. And so this is a very traditional Malay Singapore food item. But now we're working on expansion and showcasing versatility. And so we started to work on Thai style fish cakes and fish tacos. And we're actually going to be our first tasting of the fish cakes and the tacos tomorrow here in Singapore in a limited fashion. So we're serious about actually the commercial side of this and not just advancing the science. The science is important, but in as much as enabling getting products to market that help to solve a real problem. And for us, that's the laser focus is on making sure that we have products that will come to market and meet market needs. And none of this would be possible, I think, without tremendous depth of experience and expertise amongst our leadership team. So just to highlight a couple of core folks on our team here, our media development lead did a PhD in stem cell biology and has spent a couple of years at another cell-based company helping build their team up to 30 people on the R&D side and led that team. Our cell line lead has almost 25 years of experience developing cell lines with 100 plus fish cell lines developed and actually helped build the world's first fish cell bank in India. And most of our team, we're 13 today, and 6 of them are PhD scientists with tremendous technical expertise in their areas, which I think is critical when you think about bringing deep tech products to market. And so of the 13 on the team, 11 are on our R&D team, and then myself and our partnerships director, Rohit, are the 2 commercial team members. And even though we're still in this development phase right now, we thought it was critically important to bring in a strategic partnerships focused commercial lead early, knowing that it was a core part of our strategy for scale up. And I think it's a really nice marriage of people who know how to bring new technology to market through partnerships with those who can actually make the technology ready for scale up. So thanks very much for your time. I look forward to the Q&A and looking forward to bringing cultivated, not caught fish to plates very soon.
All right, super. Thank you so much, Mihir, for that presentation. You know, I was thinking about that slide that talked about the marginal cost dropping over time and how that is so critical for where we are in terms of the global economies today, which is being heavily infected by inflation. And inflation actually has materially affected the consumption of these alt meats, let's say, and people are choosing to or opt to go back to traditional types of meat and other products because they can't afford the higher prices of these plant-based as well as cell-based substitutes. I wonder if you could talk about, in that context, why the economics of what you're trying to do is so critical.
So I think in general, you can ask consumers to pay premiums in good times and not necessarily in difficult ones economically. If people have the ability to spend more, and then they can make selections about where they choose to spend extra to buy security around supply chain or traceability and sustainability. But when the constraints are much tighter on family budgets and on these kind of things, it's painful to see your food prices already 8 or 10% higher than you're used to, and then being asked to pay a premium on top of that. And so I think from a behavioral kind of incentivization and change standpoint, we have to get prices to parity, and then below parity will drive massive shifts in behavior. We don't want price to be a reason not to adopt the product. And I think as long as we can achieve that threshold, we're going in the right direction. And if we can make price then a reason to purchase the product over traditional options, then that becomes a strength. But I think for now, the goal is parity, and then we see where we can go from there.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Now, again, I don't know if it's because we're on the East Coast and closer to noon and lunchtime, but the laksa meatballs and the fish cakes and the fish tacos looks pretty appetizing. And the reason I bring it up is, I think many times consumers just automatically assume that when we're talking about culture seafood as an example, that it's going to resemble this kind of sashimi look that we're accustomed to maybe at Japanese sushi restaurants. But you're taking a different approach and you're taking different forms. And so talk about this creativity, ingenuity, and also use of plant-based and other ingredients aside from what's cultured.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think some of this is pragmatism on our part. I think a sashimi-based product will not succeed in the market to tomorrow if we were able to launch it. I think the technology is not quite there to make that a true one-for-one replacement for what consumers expect. And if you go to the highest value market segment, which by kind of volume, you see most seafood is purchased outside of a sashimi or sushi context, but your highest value seafood is most often found in that context. Those are going to be the most discerning consumers that are going to be the hardest to convince. And so our view is finding products, formats that have large enough markets and that have price points that are still viable, but don't require the most discerning consumer to be your early adopter, I think is the right balance. And so for us, these are really technical pathfinders, right? So fish balls, especially anybody who's lived in Asia can tell you, you go to a food stall and you buy a fishball soup for $3 or $4 or $5. It's a street food. It's kind of, in Singapore, it's a hawker food, so it's called. And so it's very much not the kind of product we want to launch to market, but it's culturally iconic. And so from that point of view, creating that kind of dish as a first dish, especially as somebody who's not born and raised in Singapore, I think showing that we understand the importance of identifying with the food culture of a place is really important to adoption. One of the things that is critical to making that possible is working with plant-based components to help create hybrid structures for products, because the technology to make a fish cake that can be deep fried and a fish fillet that's going to be on an open grill and these sorts of things, doing that 100% cell-based today is not feasible from anything that I've seen. And so I think it will become feasible in the future, in the next couple of years, but practicality says, can we make something today that I can get to market to a regulator next year and to a market the year after? And that's very much how we're thinking about this. And I think the reason that plant-based struggles, especially in seafood, is that the options are just poor today in terms of flavor and in terms of texture. And if we can make the flavor, nutrition, and texture substantially equivalent to traditional fish with a hybrid product, I think we'll be able to drive adoption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the points that you brought up that I think makes a lot of sense, practical sense, is that many times we are actually consuming seafood and meat in different forms. I think about Spam. I think about finished products that's like meatballs and fish cakes and other things. And that market is much bigger, right? So talk about how big some of these markets are, but also the different forms and the complexities and the derivatives of trying to support all those different forms.
Yeah. So trying to get a sense of how fish is consumed is actually one unique challenge, because it's a landed import as typically a whole fish or a whole fillet. And then what happens in terms of downstream processing is often, unless it's something that's going into a consumer good where you can track the actual purchasing of a battered fish for fish and chips in the freezer aisle, for example, some of these things get done at restaurants, and so you don't get a lot of visibility into specific formats. But I'll say, with the exception of Southern Europe, where you see a lot of just single plate fish, whitefish fillet from usually sea bream or sea bass, a lot of the world, including the US, you'll see your fillet of fish from McDonald's, and then you'll have fish fingers for kids, fish cakes in some restaurants. And those are even more pronounced trends in Asia, because fish is transformed into all sorts of dish concepts. Everything from a sumai, like a stuffed dumpling kind of concept, to just a stew where you have chunks of fish there, or a hot pot where you have a fish kind of steamed in a soup dish, but it's cut into shapes to be placed in there. And so I think the versatility is important, because if you want to sell one product, you can only, how often is somebody going to eat the same food over and over, right? I mean, that's one of your key adoption barriers. If you sell a very specific single format, it's how versatile is that format. If it's a whole fillet, it's pretty versatile because it can be transformed into whatever somebody wants to use it for. But typically, these kind of alternative products are a hamburger or a meatball. And I think one of the key challenges that those companies face now is repeat purchasing is maybe once a week or once every couple of weeks because you just don't eat that product format every day. And so our goal is to really make sure that the versatility can drive repeat purchasing, even if the formats are different.
Yeah, so one of the interesting approach that you're taking is, unlike some of the direct-to-consumer alt-meat startups, you guys are taking more of an Intel Inside approach, which also addresses the question that I was asking, which is, really doesn't matter what the final form is because you're working with the manufacturers, the distributors, the packagers, that's going to be creating the final products and forms, right?
Yeah. I mean, we think about this in two ways, right? So one is the actual solution that gets sold. So that's a true solution sale. It's a manufacturing footprint with an operating process that's semi-automated, fed by inputs on a contract. So our customer is getting something that's as close to plug and play as we can make it. But then there's an applications development side of this, which is we're basically working with a novel ingredient, right? I mean, cells are functionally, could be treated as any other specialty ingredient in food. And so our thinking is we can do what food ingredients companies do today. They have applications labs and customers come in with a concept and you co-develop, you help bring your knowledge to bear with their market know-how and figure out how to make the product that they actually can sell. And so I think the product format matters a little bit because there are limitations on what the product can do, right? If you want to make something high fat, then we need to make sure that fat doesn't change the texture and the structure too much. But I think the applications development is a really powerful toolkit to bring customers on board very early and let them co-create what they bring to market, as opposed to handing them a product and saying, please distribute this.
Now, that co-creation approach is also very powerful in the sense that there's a data advantage, right? So as you work together in a lab, eventual commercial ready, production ready types of products, there's data that's being harvested as well. Talk about what that is and why that's valuable.
Yeah. I think one of the unique approaches of sort of sitting at the center of an ecosystem in the way that we're trying to think about it is that we get to see much more than we get to see in a traditional products company. So from the get-go, developing the first couple of species, new customers will come to us with cod or a halibut or a flounder that they want us to work on for a market. And we can then develop and leverage know-how that we've already built from existing species to accelerate future inputs development around cell lines and around the media. But then as we start to scale up, we're also able to take all of our data from existing operating plants from our partners and leverage that to think about how we can scale much more quickly, because scale up is usually an expensive 12 to 18 month cycle to take a process that's been developed in the lab and to get it to an industrial process that's been troubleshot, so to speak. So our thinking here is that these production data sets and development data sets feed one another. And then this third category is actually around product co-creation. So if I've developed a fillet for a grouper before and somebody wants a snapper, I can probably leverage 80% of what I already know, help them create something new and accelerate their product development time as well. So our goal is basically to help customers come to market with a product in half the time and for less than half of what it would cost them to do it from scratch traditionally.
Now, one of the slides that you talked about is MSC stem cell line that you guys have created for eel, grouper, snapper, and eventually others. And really the key differentiation for you guys is this notion of how your stem cell approach provides that versatility and control. If you could elaborate a little bit more.
I think so. One of the challenges if you want to make complex food is that you can't just make muscle, right? Muscle by itself will be very bland and very dry. Anybody who's tasted overcooked chicken will know. But if you think about high value products, you need to add fat in, but you need different ratios of fat to muscle for different cuts. So even within a single tuna, you'll have meat from the side of the tuna that has a lower fat content that's typically grilled in the tuna steak. And then you have tuna belly that's often served as sashimi that's 35 to 40% fat. And so the ability to create and tune that ratio is important. But that tunability only really works if you can economically produce at a variable rate. Otherwise, you're limited by, if I'm producing 1-to-1 muscle and fat, then anything less than 1-to-1 combination, 50-50, I'm getting waste in my process. So the ability of the MSC is that we can flip the MSC and say we want to produce 70% muscle and 30% fat, knowing that the end product is that exact ratio. And then it allows us to use a single production line instead of multiple to make muscle, fat, and skin, for example, which really helps to cut down on CapEx for a new facility build and operational costs. So overall, it helps us keep costs low as well in production.
Great. Now, going back to the data thing again, oftentimes when we talk to culture meat startups, they don't really talk about predictive data analytics. Can you talk about the role of predictive data analytics as it pertains to some of the cell and bioprocesses and what that means for potential customers and partners?
Yeah, I mean, so this goes back to thinking about how we can accelerate development cycles. So one of the ways we do that, a very common way to screen potential conditions to explore is called DOE, or design of experiments. And it's basically a statistical approach to developing experiments to get as much data with as few tests as possible. But as few tests as possible is a relative number, and it's still quite a large number. So one of the things we're able to do is use machine learning to run 9 experiments instead of 30, for example, but extrapolate out the data as if we had run all 30, and then predict from that what set of experiments we should run next, and cut out the 50 or 60% that are unlikely to be successful, or that are predicted to be the worst performing. And so this helps us cut cost, but also time, because we're limited by how much space we have to run these experiments for optimization. And we can do a similar approach when we're going from, let's say, a 1 liter to a 20-liter bioreactor. This scale up is often challenging because the model you build on a 1 liter doesn't scale linearly to 20. You'll find new challenges your model can't predict. But we've developed an approach that seems to be much more robust in our experience right now in predicting that scale up. So we're taking an approach of basically building a model for a 1 liter, doing 1 or 2 runs in a 20 liter, and then calibrating that model so that it adapts itself to the bigger vessel. And that allows us then to, again, run a handful of experiments instead of running dozens to do scale up work, which dramatically cuts down on time. And right now that dramatically looks like about 60% of development time and cost for each phase of scale up. And so I think that translates into tremendous value to customers, de-risking their time to market and their cost to market.
Great. My last question is, as a company, where are you guys in terms of product development, customers, partnership, as well as fundraising?
So we, on product development, we now have product concepts, the likes of the fish cakes and the tacos with the battered fish fillet. The battered fish fillet, we actually now have brought on board our first MOU commercial partner to co-develop that for commercial launch. And that's actually with Ingredion, who's a large American ingredients provider. And we have a Japanese partner on board working on the cultivated eel for the Japanese market. And then we've brought on board a co-manufacturing partner basically from Malaysia to do process scale up and production to feed early manufacturing for the Southeast Asian region. So our goal now is to really prioritize the eel and the whitefish fillet products to get those ready so that we can submit a dossier to the Singapore Food Agency and the US FDA next year. And we're in the process of starting to raise a seed round to help us get to those commercial milestones over the next 6 to 12 months.
So I want to thank Mihir for a great conversation on sustainable cultivated seafood. Please give him a round of applause. We now transition to our space track to talk about UCLA and its long history in supporting the space industry.